Hey, and welcome back to JBC English Learning Academy. My name is Lura, and I'm here to guide you on your journey to clear, confident, and natural English. If you're new here, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you never miss a lesson. Your support truly helps this channel grow. All right, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin today's session. When you and I begin this journey into B2 English grammar and the common mistakes that many learners make without realizing it, I want you to imagine that we are walking together on a quiet morning street, the kind of street where the air feels soft, the light is gentle, and everything moves slowly enough for you to breathe and think clearly, because this story is not only about grammar rules, but also about the experience of learning, noticing, and understanding the language in a new way, a way that feels friendly and natural. And as we walk, I tell you that even strong intermediate English learners often have blind spots, little places in their mind where grammar feels confusing, where they think they know something but still make the same mistake again and again. And you look at me with a small smile because you know this feeling very well. Maybe you have been studying English for months or years. Maybe you have watched many videos, read many books, practiced speaking many times, yet still sometimes you say a sentence and immediately think, wait, was that right? And this small doubt sits in your heart like a soft pebble, and I tell you that this doubt is not a problem. This doubt is a sign that you are ready for the next step, the level where you stop thinking of grammar as a set of difficult rules and start seeing grammar as a way to express feelings, stories, and truth with clarity. And as we keep walking on this imaginary morning street, I begin to tell you a story about a learner named Daniel, a quiet and thoughtful man who loved English but felt stuck at B2 level for a very long time. And Daniel used to tell me that he felt like grammar was a fog around him. He could feel the meaning, he could understand the message, but when he tried to speak clearly, the fog returned, and he was never sure if his sentence was correct or not. And one day he said something interesting. He said, "I think my problem is not what I don't know. My problem is what I think I know but actually don't." And the moment he said that, I realized that most B2 learners are exactly like Daniel. They are not making beginner mistakes. They are making invisible mistakes, mistakes that feel correct because they sound familiar, mistakes like mixing up present perfect and past simple, or saying much people, or forgetting the little grammar links that make a sentence natural. And these mistakes repeat again and again because the learner cannot hear them. And as we continue walking, I tell you that our journey in this lesson is not to memorize grammar in a mechanical way, but to listen, to feel, to notice the patterns, and to understand why these mistakes happen and what you can do to avoid them naturally. Because when grammar becomes a feeling inside your body, you no longer need to think too much when you speak. The right words simply appear like a gentle stream, flowing smoothly without effort. And the first mistake I want to talk about is something that almost every B2 learner struggles with, even if they don't realize it, the confusion between present perfect and past simple. And as soon as I say these two names, you nod because you know these two forms, you learned them long ago, and you probably think you understand them, but still you sometimes say, "I have seen him yesterday," or "I saw him already." And these sentences feel correct in your mind because in your own language the logic might be different, but in English the feeling of time is very specific, very emotional, very connected to the idea of experience. And so, as we walk, I explain it in the simplest way, not with complex rules, but with a small story, a story about a girl named Maya who loved sunsets. And every evening she walked to the top of a small hill near her home to watch the sky change colors. And one day, when someone asked Maya, "Have you ever seen a perfect sunset?" she smiled and said, "Yes, I have seen many perfect sunsets." And when the same person asked, "When did you see your last perfect sunset?" Maya said, "I saw one last night." And this story shows you the difference without needing any charts or diagrams, because have seen is about life experience, something that is still connected to the present moment, like saying that sunsets are part of her life story. And saw is about a finished moment in the past, something with a clear time, something that is now closed. And as we walk, I tell you that many learners mix these forms because in their mind the past is just the past, but in English, the heart of the sentence changes depending on whether the moment is still alive in your memory now or not. And when you understand this feeling, not just the rule, your grammar begins to transform, and you start to avoid the mistake naturally, like a dancer who feels the rhythm instead of counting steps. And Daniel, our earlier learner, told me that when he finally understood this feeling, he stopped making the mistake completely, not because he memorized something, but because he felt the difference. And that is exactly what I want for you as we walk through this journey together. But then we come to another common mistake, something small but very important. The difference between to and very, and I tell you that many B2 learners say things like, the movie was too good, when they actually want to say very good, because too good in English means that the good quality was so strong that it caused a problem or something unusual, while very good simply describes something positive. And this mistake happens because many languages use one word for both meanings. But in English, feelings are measured more carefully, and I remember a moment when Daniel said, "This coffee is too nice." And I looked at him with a smile and said, "Did the coffee cause you pain? Did it ruin your morning because it was so nice?" And he laughed and said, No, I just meant it tastes great." And that is when he realized that too is not just a stronger word. It is a word with emotional weight, a word that shows discomfort or excess. And once he understood that, he never made the mistake again. And you begin to see that grammar mistakes are not random. They come from the emotional difference between languages, from the way different cultures describe the world. And as we keep walking, the soft morning light makes everything feel calm and slow, and I explain that another common mistake for B2 learners is using much with countable nouns and many with uncountable nouns. And perhaps you have said something like much people or many furniture, and you felt something strange but you couldn't correct it in time. And this happens because in the moment of speaking, your brain reaches for the first word it remembers, and the logic of countable and uncountable nouns disappears. And I tell you that the way to avoid this mistake is not to memorize lists of countable and uncountable nouns, but to use simple images, because English is a visual language, and if you can picture one person, two people, three people, then many people feels natural. And if you cannot picture one furniture, then you know that furniture must be uncountable. And when you learn to see the grammar in your imagination, the mistakes begin to fade away. Then we come to perhaps the most invisible mistake of all, forgetting little linking words like to, for, or, at, and many learners say sentences like, I listened to music, or I explained him, and they think something is wrong but they don't know why. And I tell you that these mistakes happen because English is a preposition-heavy language, a language where relationships between things are expressed through tiny words, not through endings or complex structures. And so the secret to mastering these is not memorization but repetition, noticing and listening carefully to how native speakers connect words, because prepositions are like the small threads that hold the meaning together. And when these threads are missing, even a perfect sentence feels weak and incomplete. And Daniel used to say things like, I discussed about the plan, and he felt confident. But then one day he heard a native speaker say simply, we discussed the plan, and he realized that he had been adding an extra piece for no reason. And this moment of realization changed the way he listened, and he started to notice prepositions in every sentence he heard, and slowly the mistakes disappeared. And I want you to experience the same transformation, a moment when you begin to hear English differently, not as individual words, but as a rhythm, a flow, a connected melody. As we continue walking, the imaginary street grows brighter and more alive. And I tell you that another mistake B2 learners often make is using adjectives instead of adverbs or adverbs instead of adjectives. And perhaps you have said something like, she speaks very perfect, or he drives careful. And these sentences feel almost right, but something small is missing, something smooth, something natural. And what is missing is the correct form, because adjectives describe nouns and adverbs describe verbs, and once again, the solution is not memorizing the rule but feeling the difference, because when you think of an action, something that moves, something that happens, your mind can imagine that the description must also move, must also have energy, and that is why verbs need adverbs and nouns need adjectives. And Daniel once said, "She sings beautiful." And when I asked him, "Is the singing beautiful? Or is she beautiful?" he laughed because he understood instantly, and he corrected himself to beautifully. And from that moment, he started to think not of rules, but of the story behind the sentence. And you begin to feel the same shift, a gentle transformation, a new way of understanding grammar from inside the language, not outside it. And finally, as we reach the end of our long morning walk, I tell you that all these mistakes, verb tenses, prepositions, adjectives and adverbs, countable and uncountable nouns, have one thing in common. They disappear when you slow down, listen carefully, and think in simple English, not translated English. And I explain that language learning is not about being perfect. It is about noticing, reflecting, and slowly rewiring the way you express ideas. And as we reach a small bench at the end of the street, you sit down and take a breath, and I sit next to you and say gently that this story, this lesson, this journey is not about judgment or correction. It is about awareness. Because when you become aware of your mistakes, they stop being invisible. And when they stop being invisible, you begin to grow. And as you look up at the sky, you feel something new inside you, a quiet confidence, a belief that you can speak English with more clarity, more flow, and more control, and that this journey is only beginning. And I tell you that in the next section, we will go even deeper into the mistakes that many learners never notice, the mistakes of pronunciation, structure, rhythm, and natural expression, and how to avoid them with small but powerful changes. And as the scene fades, you hear my voice from JBC English Learning Academy saying softly, "Every mistake you understand becomes your teacher, and every mistake you avoid becomes your progress." And this simple truth becomes the takeaway for this first chapter of your journey. When we begin the second part of our long journey through B2 English grammar and the common mistakes that quietly follow learners from one level to the next, I want you to imagine that we are no longer walking through a soft morning street, but sitting in a peaceful room, a room with warm light, a wooden table, and a quiet space where every sound feels clear and gentle, because this chapter is about sound, rhythm, and the invisible music inside English that many learners do not notice. And as you sit across from me, I lean forward slightly and tell you that grammar is not only about rules on a page. It is also about how the language feels when it moves through the air, how words connect, how sounds join, and how sentences breathe. And most B2 learners understand grammar on paper, but still struggle to speak naturally. Not because they don't know the rules, but because they don't know the rhythm. And this rhythm is the secret layer that makes English feel alive. And without it, sentences feel flat, heavy, or unnatural, even if every word is correct. And I remember a student named Lena who had studied English for almost 10 years, and she knew grammar very well. She could explain tenses, modal verbs, conditional sentences, and passive structures with great detail. Yet when she spoke, something felt missing, something small but very important. And one day she asked me, "Why does my English still sound strange even when my grammar is correct?" And I smiled gently, because this is one of the most common questions I hear at B2 level, and I told her that the answer is not in the words she chooses, but in the rhythm she uses, because English has a natural beat, a kind of heartbeat inside every sentence, and when learners speak without this beat, their English feels stiff, like a song played without emotion, and she looked at me with curiosity because she had never thought of English as music, and to show her what I meant, I asked her to say the sentence, "I didn't want to go there." And she said it clearly, slowly, but each word had the same weight, the same length, the same stress, and it sounded like a slow robot speaking. And then I said the same sentence in a natural way, letting some words reduce, letting some syllables almost disappear, letting the stress fall on didn't, and suddenly the sentence felt alive, natural, like something you would hear in everyday life. And Lena's eyes widened because she had heard that kind of English before, but she had never understood the secret behind it. As you sit in the quiet room with me, I tell you that one of the biggest mistakes B2 learners make is trying to pronounce every word fully, clearly, and separately, because they think this will make their English better, but in reality, it makes their English sound unnatural because native speakers do not pronounce every word fully. Instead, they connect words, reduce sounds, and allow their sentences to move like a gentle wave. And this is where mistakes with articles, linking words, and prepositions become even more noticeable, because when the rhythm is wrong, even a small mispronunciation feels bigger, and I explain that English is a stress-timed language, which means some words carry strong stress and others become weak, almost invisible, and learners who come from syllable-timed languages where every syllable has equal strength, often speak English with a flat rhythm. And this creates confusion not only for them, but also for the people listening to them, because native speakers expect English to move with a certain pattern, and when that pattern changes, understanding becomes harder, even if the grammar is correct. Then I tell you about another learner named Hassan, a very kind and thoughtful man who loved English movies and songs but still felt nervous speaking, and one day he told me, "I think people don't understand me because I make grammar mistakes." But when I listened to him, I realized his grammar was fine, not perfect, but good enough for communication, and the real problem was that he paused in the wrong places. He stressed the wrong words, and he pronounced small function words like to, at, and for too strongly, even though native speakers make these words soft and light, and his sentences sounded like a series of separate blocks instead of one connected message. And I explained to him that English is not only about the words you say, but how you say them. And once he started practicing the natural rhythm, his confidence grew quickly, not because he became perfect, but because he began to sound more natural. Now, as we sit together in the warm light of the quiet room, I tell you that rhythm mistakes often lead to grammar mistakes, and you look at me with surprise, because most learners think these two things are separate. But the truth is that when you don't know where the stress should be, you may accidentally stress the wrong part of a sentence and confuse the meaning. And I give you a simple example. When learners say, "I want to go," with too much stress on want, it sounds like they are correcting someone, but when they say, "I want to go," with natural rhythm, it sounds like a simple statement. And this small difference changes the emotional meaning of the sentence. And English is full of sentences where changing the stress changes everything, like, I didn't say he stole the money versus I didn't say he stole the money. And each version communicates something different even though the words stay the same. And when you understand this idea, you begin to see that rhythm is not an optional skill, it is part of grammar itself. And then I explain another invisible mistake that almost every B2 learner makes: overusing unnecessary words, especially that which and who, because they want to make their sentences sound more complete. But sometimes in English, a simple structure is not only correct but also more natural, and learners often say sentences like, "I think that it is important that you understand that grammar is not everything," and while the sentence is not wrong, it feels heavy and repetitive and native. Speakers would usually say something like, "I think it's important for you to understand that grammar isn't everything." And I tell you that learning to remove unnecessary words is a kind of art, a skill that grows with practice and listening. And once you learn this skill, your English becomes lighter, clearer, and more natural. At this point in our conversation, I ask you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are listening to two voices speaking English. One is a learner who speaks correctly but without rhythm, and the other is a native speaker who uses rhythm naturally. And as you listen in your imagination, you begin to notice that the second voice feels smoother, warmer, and easier to understand, even though both voices are using correct grammar. And this is the moment when you understand that sounding natural does not come from speaking fast or using complicated vocabulary. It comes from using simple words with the right rhythm, the right stress, and the right emotional balance. And I tell you that another common mistake B2 learners make is trying to speak too fast, thinking that speed equals fluency. But fluency is not about speed. Fluency is about flow, and you can speak slowly and still sound fluent if your speech has rhythm and confidence. And many learners get stuck because they push themselves to speak quickly, and when they do, they lose control. They make more grammar mistakes, they forget words, and they feel embarrassed. And this creates a cycle of anxiety. And I tell you gently that you do not need to speak fast to sound good. You need to speak clearly, calmly, and naturally. And once you focus on clarity instead of speed, your grammar mistakes begin to disappear because your mind has time to think, time to choose the right structure, time to feel the sentence before sending it into the world. Then I tell you about something even deeper: the mistake of translating directly from your own language, because direct translation often breaks the rhythm of English. And when the rhythm breaks, the grammar breaks with it. And this is why learners sometimes say things like, "I very like it," because in some languages the structure makes sense. But in English, the rhythm expects, "I really like it." And when you try to replace really with very, the rhythm collapses and the sentence feels unnatural. And this is a sign that grammar cannot be separated from meaning, and meaning cannot be separated from rhythm. And this connection explains why some learners understand English perfectly but still struggle to speak, because their mind is working too hard to translate instead of flowing naturally with the language. As we continue our peaceful conversation in the room, I tell you that the next mistake is one of the most emotional: avoiding contractions like don't, isn't, can't, won't, I'm, you're, and there, because learners think that using full forms like do not, is not, and I am sounds more correct. But in everyday English, using full forms all the time sounds unnatural, formal, or even cold. And this mistake makes conversations feel heavy and distant. And I tell you that using contractions is not only acceptable but necessary if you want to sound natural, because contractions give rhythm to sentences, they make speech faster, lighter, and more connected, and they help you avoid making tense mistakes because the contraction forces you to say the verb correctly. And I remember how Lena used to say, "I am not ready. I do not know. You are correct." And the sentences sounded like lines from a textbook instead of real conversation. And when she finally learned to use contractions, her speaking transformed completely, and she told me, "I feel like I am finally speaking real English." And I smiled because this is the exact transformation many B2 learners experience when they begin to trust the natural flow of the language. And as our long conversation reaches its gentle closing point, I tell you that the biggest mistake of all is thinking that grammar is separate from everything else, because grammar lives inside rhythm, pronunciation, emotion, and meaning, and when you see the connection, you begin to improve more quickly, not because you study harder, but because you understand the language on a deeper level. And when you leave the quiet room in your imagination, you feel something new inside you, a soft but powerful realization that learning English is not only about understanding rules, but also about feeling the music behind the words, and this feeling becomes your guide in the next steps of your journey. And as you stand up from the wooden table, I tell you softly that in the next section we will go even deeper into common grammar mistakes that appear in storytelling, conversation, descriptions, and real-life situations, and how to avoid them naturally through awareness and practice. And as you walk toward the door, the warm light follows you, and you hear my voice from JBC English Learning Academy saying, "English becomes easier when you listen to its rhythm," and with that thought, you leave the room ready for the next chapter of your transformation. When we enter the third chapter of this long journey together, I want you to imagine that we are no longer sitting in a quiet room and no longer walking down a gentle morning street, but instead we find ourselves in a small town on a warm afternoon, the kind of town where the streets are calm, the houses are close together, and the sounds around us feel soft and familiar, because this chapter is about real-life English, the English people use every day, and to explore this type of English, we need a place where daily life happens, where people talk, share, argue, laugh, and tell stories, and in this small town, we will meet a few characters who will show us the most common grammar mistakes that B2 learners make when speaking naturally, especially when emotions appear, because grammar mistakes often happen not when we are thinking, but when we are feeling something strongly. And as we walk down the main street of this imaginary town, the warm sun touches the ground gently, and I tell you that today's lesson is about grammar in action, grammar inside conversations, grammar inside conflicts, grammar inside feelings, and grammar inside storytelling, because when English becomes emotional, many learners lose control of their grammar without noticing. And the first person we meet in this town is a young man named Eric, a friendly shopkeeper who sells fresh bread every morning, and as we step inside his small bakery, the smell of warm bread fills the air, and Eric looks at us with a bright smile and says, "I'm so happy you both arrived here. I'm baking new bread since this morning." And as soon as he says that sentence, you notice something feels strange, and I tell you softly that this is one of the most common B2 mistakes, using the present perfect continuous when the speaker actually needs the present perfect or past simple, because Eric says, "I'm baking new bread since this morning," but that form is not natural in English, and the correct sentence should be, "I've been baking new bread since this morning," because the action started in the past and is still happening now, and many learners make this mistake because in their languages the expression might be literal, something like, "I bake from the morning," but in English, the connection between the past and the present must be expressed through the perfect form, and Eric laughs when we gently correct him, and he says, "Ah, yes, I always confuse these tenses." And this becomes our first lesson in the town. Real-life English needs real-life grammar, and the Perfect tenses appear more often than learners expect. Then, as we leave the bakery and walk down the street, we see a woman named Sophia sitting outside her house, reading a book, and she smiles at us and says, "I didn't finish this book yet." And again you hear something unusual, something that doesn't sound right, and I tell you that this is another very common mistake. Using a past tense form with time expressions that show something is still happening, and the correct form should be, "I haven't finished this book yet," because the book is still unfinished in the present moment, and the word yet naturally pulls the sentence into the present perfect tense. And this mistake is so common that even advanced learners sometimes make it, especially when speaking quickly. And as we continue our walk, you start to notice that perfect tenses create a kind of thread connecting the past to now, a small bridge that many learners forget to use. And when they forget this bridge, their sentences become unclear, even if the meaning is still understandable. After leaving Sofia, we walk toward a park filled with children playing, and there we meet a teenager named Mia, who is practicing her guitar under a tree, and she looks at us shyly and says, "I want to improve my guitar because I want to be more better." And she laughs because she knows her English is not perfect, but she tries her best, and I explain to you that this is a common B2 mistake. Using a double comparative and saying more better is incorrect because better already carries the comparative meaning, and the correct sentence is simply, "I want to be better," or "I want to be much better," depending on the feeling. And Mia nods as she listens, and we sit for a moment under the tree, hearing her guitar strings vibrate in the warm air. And I tell you that comparative forms often create confusion because learners want to make the meaning stronger, but they add unnecessary words. And the secret is to strengthen the sentence with adverbs like much, a lot, or far, instead of doubling the comparative form. And when you learn this, your sentences become simpler and more natural. After thanking Mia, we walk toward the small town square, where a group of friends are sitting around a fountain talking loudly and laughing. And as we approach them, one of the friends, a man named Carlos, says, "We was waiting for the bus for almost an hour." And he looks frustrated, and immediately you can hear the mistake, because "we was" is incorrect, even though it is extremely common among learners who speak quickly and emotionally, and the correct form is "we were waiting for the bus." And I explain that the verb to be in the past can be tricky when you are speaking emotionally, because when anger or impatience appears, grammar often disappears, and this is exactly why we study real-life situations, because grammar must work even when you are frustrated, tired, excited, or surprised. And when you learn to stay calm inside your mind, your grammar becomes stable, even during emotional conversations. Then, as the conversation continues, another friend in the group, a woman named Hannah, tells us a story, and she says, "I have went to that restaurant last week." And again you hear the mistake immediately, because have went is one of the most common irregular verb mistakes learners make at B2 level, and the correct form should be, "I went" for a finished past action, or "I have gone" when referring to life experience without a specific time. And the problem here is that Hannah mixed the forms without understanding the time meaning. And I tell you that irregular verbs do not follow patterns. They must be felt, repeated, and remembered through real stories and real situations. And Hannah smiles shyly as she corrects herself, and her friends laugh and tease her gently, but she doesn't mind, because she knows every mistake is a chance to grow. As we leave the group of friends and walk toward the edge of the town, we meet an older man named Mr. Collins, who spends every afternoon sitting in a rocking chair outside his home, watching the people pass. and he looks at us with a thoughtful expression and says, "People in this town is very friendly." And I tell you that this is another small but very common B2 mistake. Using is with a plural subject because the mind focuses on the word town instead of the word people, and this creates confusion. But the correct form is people in this town are very friendly, and many learners make this mistake because they respond emotionally to the idea of the town rather than the grammar of the sentence. And I explain that paying attention to the true subject of the sentence is important, especially when the subject is a collective idea like people, students, workers, or travelers. Because English grammar requires agreement between subject and verb, even when your emotions are focused somewhere else. Then Mr. Collins tells us a short story about his grandson, and he says he doesn't know how to swim. And as he says this, you hear the mistake clearly because doesn't already carries the meaning of the negative. So the verb must stay in the base form, know, not knows. And I tell you that this mistake appears everywhere in B2 conversations because learners often add the S automatically, especially when speaking quickly. And this is one of the most important things to remember when using does. The main verb is always simple, always clean, always without extra letters, and this rule helps avoid many common grammar mistakes in everyday speech. As we continue our walk through the warm afternoon, we finally reach a small hill at the edge of the town, and we sit down in the soft grass overlooking the rooftops, and from this quiet place we reflect on everything we have seen. The perfect tense mistakes, the comparative mistakes, the verb agreement mistakes, the irregular verb mistakes, the emotional mistakes, the rhythm mistakes, and the small but powerful errors that appear when real people use real English. And I tell you that the most important lesson from today is not about rules but about awareness, because when you start noticing these mistakes in others, you begin to notice them in yourself, and when you notice them in yourself, you begin to change them, and this change happens slowly, naturally, and gently over time. Then I tell you that grammar is not something separate from life. Grammar lives inside conversations, stories, emotions, and relationships, and the more you listen to real English, the more you understand the natural patterns, and the easier it becomes to avoid these mistakes without thinking too much. And as the warm afternoon light begins to soften, I tell you that the next chapter of our journey will take us deeper into mistakes connected to conditionals, questions, word order, and natural phrasing, and we will learn how to speak with clarity even in complex situations. And as you stand up from the hill, the wind moves softly through the grass, and you hear my voice from JBC English Learning Academy saying gently, every time you notice a mistake, you take one step closer to mastery, and with this soft realization, you leave the hill ready for the next part of your transformation. As we move into the fourth chapter of our long, gentle journey through B2 English grammar, I want you to imagine that we are standing at the edge of a quiet lake just before sunset, the air cool and soft, the water calm and still, almost like a mirror reflecting the pink and golden sky above, and this peaceful place feels perfect for learning about clarity, because clarity in English is like the surface of this lake, smooth, balanced, stable, and easy to understand. And today we will explore some of the most powerful but also the most confusing parts of grammar, word order, question forms, and conditional sentences, because these structures are where many B2 learners struggle the most, and they often feel that something is wrong with their English but cannot explain what it is. And as we stand near the water with a soft breeze touching our faces, I tell you that this chapter will reveal mistakes that hide inside long sentences, inside questions, inside if statements, inside hopes, fears, dreams, and possibilities, because grammar becomes more complicated when you begin to talk about things that are not real yet, things that only might happen, things that could happen, or things you wish had happened. And to begin, I tell you a story about a young woman named Julia who loved to take photos of the lake every evening. And one day she told me something interesting. She said, "Sometimes I feel my English sounds like the picture is beautiful but not clear." And as she said this, she held up her camera and showed me a photo that was colorful but slightly out of focus. And I told her that many B2 learners feel exactly the same, because they know many words, they know many rules, and they can express many ideas, but sometimes their sentences feel blurry, especially when the sentence is long, emotional, or complicated, and many times the cause of this blurriness is word order, because English has a very specific rhythm for arranging words, and when that rhythm is broken, the meaning becomes unclear. To explain this, I ask you to imagine a simple sentence like, "I never forget my first teacher," and you understand the meaning immediately, but then imagine a learner saying, "Never I forget my first teacher," and suddenly the sentence feels strange, not wrong enough to confuse you, but wrong enough to feel unnatural, and this is a typical B2 mistake, putting adverbs in the wrong place, placing never, always, often, usually, or sometimes in positions that break the natural flow of English, and I tell you that these adverbs almost always go before the main verb and after the subject, unless the verb is to be, in which case the adverb follows the verb, and once you understand this feeling, the sentence becomes clearer, smoother, easier to understand, just like the lake in front of us. Then I explain another common mistake, putting time, place, and manner in the wrong order, because English prefers a certain sequence, usually manner, place, time, and many learners say sentences like, "I go always at night to the gym," which feels uncomfortable, like walking with stones in your shoes, and the more natural version is, "I always go to the gym at night," and this sounds smooth, natural, and effortless. And I tell you that learning the natural order of words does not require memorizing long lists. It simply requires noticing, listening, and feeling the structure in real conversations, movies, and stories. As we keep talking by the lake, the sky begins to turn a deeper shade of orange and the water reflects it beautifully. And I tell you that mistakes become even more visible when learners form questions, especially when they try to speak quickly. And this is because questions in English require an extra step, an extra movement, the inversion of the subject and the auxiliary verb, and many B2 learners forget this step, especially when they are nervous or excited, and they say sentences like, "You know where is the station?" instead of, "Do you know where the station is?" or "Why he didn't came?" instead of, "Why didn't he come?" And these mistakes are extremely common because the brain tries to follow the pattern of the learner's native language. And I tell you that the key to forming questions correctly is to remember one simple truth. When an auxiliary verb is present, the main verb must be in base form, and the subject moves after the auxiliary verb. And once you feel this pattern, your questions become clear and natural. And then I tell you that the most emotional grammar mistakes appear in conditional sentences, because conditionals are not only grammar. They're about hopes, plans, regrets, dreams, possibilities, and imaginary worlds, and when emotions enter a sentence, grammar often becomes unstable, but conditionals are powerful, and if you use them well, you can express your life with so much clarity and meaning. And to help you understand this, I introduce you to another person from our story world, a young man named Ryan, who comes to the lake every day to think, reflect, and plan his future, and one evening he said to me, "If I will have time tomorrow, I will finish my project." And this is one of the most common B2 mistakes, using will in both parts of the first conditional, because many languages allow this, but English does not, and the correct form is, "If I have time tomorrow, I will finish my project." And this rule is like the rule of nature. One part is in the present simple, and the other part uses will, and when you understand this, your sentences instantly become clearer. Then Ryan told me another sentence. He said, "If I would know more English, I would travel more." And although the meaning is clear, the structure is not correct because the second conditional requires the past simple in the if part and would in the other part. So the correct form is, "If I knew more English, I would travel more." And this form expresses an unreal situation, something that is not true right now. And this type of sentence is one of the most common places where B2 learners mix up grammar. But once you understand that the past simple is used not for past time, but for unreal meaning, your sentences start to shine with clarity. And then Ryan sighed deeply and said, "If I would studied harder in school, I would be a doctor now." And this is the third common conditional mistake, mixing second and third conditional forms, and the correct version is, "If I had studied harder in school, I would be a doctor now." And I tell you that this mixed structure is actually very useful because it expresses something that happened in the past but has a result in the present, and many learners are afraid of it because it feels complicated. But once you see its purpose, you begin to love it because it gives you the power to talk about your life in a deeper way. As the sun continues to go down, we walk closer to the water's edge, and I tell you that conditionals also reveal another B2 mistake, forgetting the difference between could, would, and should, and learners often mix them without noticing, but each of these words carries a different emotional meaning, and using the wrong one can change the meaning of your sentence completely. And I explain that would expresses desire or imagination, could expresses ability or possibility, and should expresses advice or recommendation. And when you use them correctly, your conditional sentences become powerful tools for expressing your thoughts clearly. Then we sit on a large rock near the lake and listen to the soft sound of water touching the shore. And I tell you that another common B2 mistake happens when learners confuse because and so, and they say sentences like, "Because it was raining, so I stayed home," which is incorrect because English does not allow both in the same sentence, and the correct version is either "Because it was raining, I stayed home," or "It was raining, so I stayed home." And this mistake happens because learners want the sentence to feel strong and complete, but in English, these two words cannot live together in the same clause, and once you learn this, your sentences become clearer and more natural. Then we stand up again, and the sun is now almost touching the horizon, and the entire lake glows with warm light. And I tell you that all these mistakes, word order, adverb placement, question formation, conditional structures, and linking words, have one thing in common. They become easier to avoid when you speak slowly, when you breathe, when you allow yourself to think for one extra second before speaking. Because clarity is not about speed, clarity is about intention, and when you speak with intention, your grammar becomes stronger. And as the final light of the sun fades, I tell you softly that in the next section we will explore mistakes connected to storytelling, descriptions, emotional expression, and advanced structures like reported speech and passive voice, because these areas challenge even strong B2 learners, and understanding them will help you speak English with confidence, clarity, and natural flow. And as the sky turns dark blue and the first stars appear above the lake, you hear my voice from JBC English Learning Academy saying, "Clarity begins when you learn to place each word exactly where it belongs." And with this gentle thought, we leave the lakeside ready for the next step of your journey. As we enter the fifth chapter of this long, gentle English journey, I want you to imagine that we are walking through a quiet forest path at dusk, the sky turning a soft purple, and the tall trees around us creating a peaceful tunnel of light and shadow. Because this chapter is about storytelling and description, and stories always live close to nature, close to emotion, close to silence, and close to memory. And I tell you that one of the biggest challenges for B2 learners is using grammar correctly when they're trying to tell a story, because in storytelling, the mind is focused not on grammar but on images, feelings, characters, and events, and when emotions rise, grammar often disappears and the sentences become confused, mixed, broken, or unnatural. Not because the learner doesn't know the rules, but because the heart moves faster than the grammar in the brain. And in this chapter, we will explore the most common mistakes that appear when learners describe memories, tell stories, talk about dreams, share experiences, or express strong emotions. As we walk deeper into the forest, I tell you that the first mistake many B2 learners make when telling stories is mixing past tenses without meaning, especially confusing the past simple with the past continuous or the past perfect. And I introduce you to a woman named Elena, a traveler who has walked through many forests and collected many stories, and one evening she said to me, "I was walked through the forest, and I hear a strange sound." And though her meaning was clear, the grammar felt twisted because was walked is incorrect, and here should be in the past form, and the natural version would be, I was walking through the forest and I heard a strange sound. And I explain that story grammar in English is like painting a picture. The past continuous paints the background, the action that is already happening, while the past simple paints the main events, the things that happen suddenly. And when you understand this, your stories become clearer and more powerful. Then Elena continued her story and said, "When I arrived home, I realized I forget my bag." And this is another very common B2 level mistake, forgetting to use the past perfect when two past actions happen at different times, especially when one action happened before the other. And the correct form is, I realized I had forgotten my bag, because the forgetting happened before the realizing. And I tell you that the past perfect is not something you have to use all the time, but in stories it helps the listener understand the order of events without confusion. And I explain that using the past perfect is like turning on a small light that shows the listener what happened first. And once you learn to use it naturally, your stories become smoother and easier to follow. As we walk further along the forest path, the sound of small insects fills the air, and the trees begin to glow with the soft colors of dusk. And I tell you that another common mistake learners make when describing things is using too many adjectives or using them in the wrong order. And many B2 learners say sentences like, "a wooden small beautiful house," which sounds unnatural, because English follows a natural order of adjectives: opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, noun. And although this order may sound complicated, it becomes natural with practice, and the correct version would be a beautiful small wooden house. And when you learn to place adjectives in the right order, your descriptions become smooth and musical, almost like poetry. Then I tell you about another learner named Samira, who loved to write stories but always struggled to describe people naturally. And one day she said, she has hair long and black. And this is a common mistake because in English, hair is usually uncountable when describing someone's hair in general. So we say, she has long black hair. And this small change makes the sentence sound much more natural. And I tell you that description mistakes often come from direct translation, and once you understand how English imagines things differently, your sentences become clearer. As the forest becomes darker, we reach a small wooden bridge over a quiet stream, and the sound of water helps us slow down even more. And I tell you that storytelling also reveals mistakes in reported speech, which is a common challenge for B2 learners, especially when the speaker changes time, place, or perspective, and many learners say things like, "She told me she is tired," when the correct form, depending on the context, might be, "She told me she was tired," because the tense usually shifts back in reported speech, and learners often forget this because shifting tenses feels unnatural. But I explain that in English, reported speech moves the story one step away from the original moment, and this step backward creates the tense shift. And once you feel this movement, the grammar becomes much easier to use. Then we continue walking over the bridge, and I tell you that another very common mistake in storytelling is mixing direct and indirect speech incorrectly, like saying, "He asked me where did I go," when the correct form is, "He asked me where I went," because questions lose their inversion in reported speech, and many B2 learners make this mistake because their mind wants to hold on to the original question structure. But English requires a calmer form when telling someone else's question, and once you understand this calmness, your stories flow more naturally. As we continue walking deeper into the forest, we notice small fireflies beginning to glow around us, their gentle lights floating like tiny stars, and in this magical moment, I tell you that another mistake B2 learners make when telling emotional stories is confusing say and tell, and using them incorrectly, like saying, "He said me the truth," which feels uncomfortable in English because say does not take a person directly after it, and the correct form is, "He told me the truth," or "He said, this is the truth." And this difference is simple but very important, because it helps your stories sound more natural and complete. Then we reach a place in the forest where the trees open up and moonlight shines on a small clearing, and we sit on a low rock while the night becomes deeper around us. And I tell you that many B2 learners also struggle with the passive voice, especially when telling stories where the focus is on the result rather than the person doing the action. And some learners say sentences like, "The window broke by the wind," which is incorrect, because the correct passive form is, "The window was broken by the wind." And I explain that the passive voice in English always needs a form of be plus a past participle, and once you feel this structure, you can use it to tell stories in a more descriptive way. Then I talk about another common mistake that appears in emotional storytelling, using the wrong connectors, especially confusing although, despite, and in spite of, and learners often say things like, "Although of the rain, we continued walking," which is incorrect because although must be followed by a clause, while despite and in spite of must be followed by a noun or gerund, and the correct forms are, "Although it was raining, we continued walking," or "Despite the rain, we continued walking," and these connectors help you express contrast, emotion, conflict, and surprise in your stories, making them more engaging and meaningful. As we sit in the clearing, we hear the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind and the soft sounds of the forest at night. And I tell you that another very common mistake in storytelling is confusing used to with be used to, and learners say things like, "I am used to play football," when the correct form is, "I am used to playing football," because used to describes a past habit, while be used to describes being comfortable with something in the present, and understanding this difference helps you talk about your past and your present with clarity. Then I tell you that emotional description also reveals mistakes in relative clauses, especially when learners forget who, which, or that, or use them incorrectly, and they say things like, "The girl I met her yesterday," which is incorrect because the object pronoun her must be removed, and the correct sentence is the girl I met yesterday or the girl who I met yesterday. And I explained that English often avoids repeating objects in relative clauses, and once you learn this pattern, your sentences sound more elegant and natural. As the night becomes darker and the forest becomes quieter, I tell you that another common problem in storytelling is overusing the present simple when describing feelings or past events, and learners say things like, I feel scared and the man comes closer, even though the story is in the past, and the correct form is I felt scared and the man came closer. And this mistake happens because storytelling is emotional. And when your emotions rise, your mind returns to simple forms. But learning to control your tense even during emotional moments is the key to sounding natural. Then we stand up again, ready to leave the clearing, and I tell you that all these mistakes, story tense confusion, adjective order, reported speech errors, passive voice problems, connector confusion, relative clause issues, have one thing in common. They disappear when you slow down, breathe, and speak with intention, because storytelling is not a race. Storytelling is a slow expression of who you are and what you have experienced. And when you speak slowly, your grammar begins to catch up with your emotions. And as we walk back toward the path, the soft light of the moon guiding our steps, I tell you that the next section will bring everything together, helping you understand how to turn grammar knowledge into natural fluency, how to avoid mistakes in real conversations, and how to speak with confidence, emotion, and clarity every day. And as we leave the forest and step into the open night, you hear my voice from JBC English Learning Academy saying, your stories deserve clear grammar because your voice deserves to be heard. And with this thought, you move forward into the final part of your journey. As we enter the final chapter of this long and gentle journey together, I want you to imagine that we are walking toward a lighthouse at the edge of a quiet ocean, the night sky wide and deep above us, stars shining like small promises, and the cool air carrying the soft smell of the sea, because this last chapter is about guidance, direction, and learning how to use everything you now understand to become a natural, confident English speaker, and the lighthouse in front of us represents your future fluency, your ability to speak clearly, correctly, and calmly in any situation. And in this final part, we will explore how common mistakes show up in real conversation, how you can recognize them before they happen, and how you can transform your grammar knowledge into a natural flow that feels easy rather than heavy, connected rather than stressful, and expressive rather than limited. As we walk slowly toward the lighthouse, you hear the calm sound of waves touching the shore, and I tell you that the biggest challenge for many B2 learners is not grammar itself, but the feeling of switching between knowing the rule and using the rule, between understanding the theory and speaking in real time, between remembering the correct form and actually producing the correct form while thinking, feeling, reacting, and trying to communicate at the same time. And many learners feel frustrated because mistakes appear even when they know the rule well, and I tell you gently that this is normal, natural, human, and temporary, because fluency does not come from perfect memory. It comes from awareness, and awareness grows slowly, like the soft light of the lighthouse growing brighter as we walk closer to it. Then I tell you that the first step toward mastery is learning to notice your mistakes with kindness, without judgment, without pressure, without fear, because fear freezes your speaking, but kindness opens your mind, and many learners try to speak perfectly and become discouraged when they make a mistake. But I tell you that mistakes are not signs of weakness. They are signs of growth, because a mistake only appears when you are trying something new, something bigger, something more advanced. And I tell you that when you notice your own mistakes, you should not feel embarrassed. Instead, you should feel grateful, because noticing is the first step to changing, and changing is the heart of learning. And as we walk a little nearer to the lighthouse, the sound of the ocean becomes stronger, and the wind becomes slightly colder, and I tell you about a young man named Daniel, who worked very hard to improve his English and knew many rules, but felt frustrated because mistakes still appeared when he spoke quickly, and one evening he said to me, "I know the grammar, but my mouth doesn't listen to my brain." And I smiled because I understood exactly how he felt, and I told him that fluency begins not by controlling every sentence, but by slowing down the mind just enough to let the grammar settle, because when you slow down, even for 1 second, your brain can choose the correct tense, the correct structure, the correct word order, and soon that small pause becomes unnecessary because your brain learns to choose naturally, automatically, almost instantly. As we continue along the sandy path, the lighthouse light sweeps across the water in long, slow circles, and I tell you that another important part of mastery is learning to predict your own mistakes before they happen, almost like seeing a small wave coming toward your feet and stepping aside before it touches you. And to explain this, I want you to imagine that you are speaking about your plans for tomorrow, and you feel yourself wanting to say, "If I will finish early, I will go to the park." And because you have learned about conditionals, you can already sense that something is wrong. You can feel that will should not be in the if part, and because you can feel it, you can stop it before the mistake leaves your mouth. And this is fluency. Not perfection, not memorizing rules forever, but noticing the feeling of a sentence and choosing the natural version. Then I tell you that prediction also helps with question forms, because many learners begin a question and suddenly realize they forgot the auxiliary verb. But when you practice, you begin to sense the shape of a question before you speak, and your mouth automatically prepares to say do, does, did, have, has, is, or are at the beginning, and this awareness slowly replaces confusion with confidence. We walk closer to the lighthouse now, and the stone walls become clearer, strong, and bright under the moonlight. And I tell you that the next part of mastery is learning to control your emotions while speaking, because strong feelings, nervousness, excitement, fear, embarrassment, or stress can break grammar more quickly than anything else, especially during job interviews, exams, presentations, or first conversations with someone important to you. And I explain that when your emotions rise, your brain moves to survival mode, and survival mode always chooses simple grammar, even if you know more advanced structures. And I tell you that the solution is not trying to shut down your emotions, but learning to breathe through them. Speak more slowly, speak with more pauses, and give your mind time to choose the right forms, because fluency grows in calmness, and calmness grows in breath. As we reach the base of the lighthouse, we climb a short set of stone steps, each one smooth from many years of footsteps, and I tell you that another part of turning grammar into fluency is building strong habits of listening, because listening is the foundation of speaking, and the more English you hear, the more natural grammar becomes, not because you study rules, but because you feel them, like music, like rhythm, like nature. And I tell you that when you listen to stories, movies, podcasts, or real conversations, your brain begins to copy the patterns automatically, especially word order, question forms, and connective structures, and soon these patterns become part of your speaking without effort, without force, without pressure. We reach the lighthouse door, open it, and begin walking up the spiral staircase inside, the steps narrow but steady, and the air cool and silent. And as we climb, I tell you that one of the most powerful ways to gain fluency is to practice speaking aloud every day, even if you are alone, even if you have no partner, because speaking is physical, speaking is movement, speaking is muscle memory. And your mouth needs practice, just like your brain needs practice, and I suggest speaking slowly, telling simple stories about your day, describing the things around you, imagining conversations, or repeating sentences you hear from English videos, because your mouth learns through repetition, and repetition creates fluency. Then I explained that you can also practice correcting yourself gently, noticing your mistakes while speaking and trying again, without frustration, without judgment, just curiosity, and this habit builds stronger grammar faster than studying rules for hours. We continue climbing the lighthouse stairs, hearing the echo of our footsteps, and I tell you that mastery also requires removing certain habits that make your English weaker, such as translating directly from your native language, because direct translation often leads to unnatural word order, missing articles, wrong prepositions, and unnatural expressions. And I tell you that one way to reduce translation is to memorize small chunks of English, short phrases, common patterns, natural expressions, and use them as complete pieces, and the more chunks you learn, the more fluent you sound, because you are not building every sentence from zero. You are using familiar, ready-made pieces of language that native speakers use all the time. As we climb higher, a soft, warm light begins to appear above us, and I tell you that another important part of grammar mastery is understanding that not all mistakes are equal, and some mistakes are more important to fix than others, and I explain that mistakes which confuse meaning, like wrong verb tenses, wrong word order, incorrect conditionals, or unclear questions, should be your priority, because they affect communication, but small mistakes that do not block understanding, like using the wrong article sometimes or choosing the slightly wrong preposition, are less urgent, and you can improve them slowly over time, without pressure, without fear, and this understanding helps you relax and focus on what matters most. We reach the top of the lighthouse now, and the room is warm and bright, with large windows all around us, showing the wide ocean below, the stars above, and the calm world around us. And as we stand in this peaceful place, watching the lighthouse light move slowly in circles, I tell you that the final step of turning grammar knowledge into fluency is trust. Trust in your progress, trust in your learning, trust in your mind, and trust in your voice, because confidence is not something you receive from outside. It grows from within, step by step, moment by moment, conversation by conversation. And I tell you that the more you speak, the more you listen, the more you practice, the more you notice, and the more you correct yourself with kindness, the stronger your fluency becomes. And then, as we look out over the ocean together, I tell you that grammar is not the goal. Communication is the goal. Connection is the goal. Expression is the goal. And grammar is simply the bridge that helps you move across the water of misunderstanding toward the land of clarity, confidence, and connection. We stand in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sound of the waves far below, and I tell you that you now have the tools to avoid the most common B2 mistakes, the understanding to speak more clearly, and the awareness to continue improving every day, and that this journey has been about more than grammar. It has been about finding your rhythm, your expression, your courage, your voice. And as the lighthouse light turns once more, washing the room in warm brightness, you hear my voice from JBC English Learning Academy saying, "Fluency grows inside you, step by step, word by word, story by story." And with that gentle message, you take a slow breath, look out at